Visiting Artist Program. The Visiting Artist Program is cooperatively presented by the Owens Art Gallery, the Fine Arts Department here at Mount Allison University, and Struts Gallery, and is funded by the Canada Council for the Arts. Lisa is the last speaker to deal with the theme of landscape from the Visiting Artist Program series entitled Dead Horse, Contemporary Art About Issues of Landscape. In 2004, she exhibited her series entitled Threshold here at Struts Gallery, here in Sackville, I guess. And more recently, as some of you may have seen, she also had a solo exhibition here at the Owens Art Gallery last fall entitled Liminal. This exhibition, which comprised of a series of photographs and videos, was organized and circulated by the Southern Alberta Art Gallery with the support of the Canada Council for the Arts. A book titled Liminal was published in conjunction with the exhibition. Lisa Klapstock was born in Kamloops, British Columbia, and since 1995 has been living in Toronto. She has a communications degree from Simon Fraser University and a diploma in sight and sound film production from the New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Lisa's work focuses on everyday places and the ways in which they are occupied by people. She investigates what she describes as mechanisms of seeing and the role of the camera in affecting and challenging the way we view and experience our surroundings. Both her photographic and video work reveal the relationship between photographic depiction and visual perception. Lisa's work has been exhibited widely in North America and Europe, including shows at the Center for Photography in New York and Presentation House Gallery in Vancouver. Her work is both in corporate and public collections, including the Portrait Gallery of Canada, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, Kamloops Art Gallery. She has participated in artist residencies in the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, and Banff, Alberta. Currently, she is represented in Toronto by Jessica Bradley Art and Projects, and in Vancouver by Diane Ferris Gallery. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Klapstock.
It's great to be here. It's a miracle that I'm here. I don't know if any of you know that I tried to be here twice before, and various things were conspiring against me coming to Sackville. And in fact, this morning at Toronto Pearson, we were told that the plane was probably not going to be able to land today in Moncton. Anyway, so I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank Jemmy and John and the university for bringing me here. Tonight I'm going to talk, I didn't tailor my talk explicitly to address landscape, although my work does address landscape, different kinds of landscape. So I'll be touching on landscape, but I'm mostly going to be talking about process, artistic process tonight. And I just want to start by reading this quote. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. The photograph is a threshold between reality and perception. It is a representation of reality and of perception. Reality, perception. And that's the way I see the photograph. That's my quote. And that quote is a good starting point to talk about my work, since one of my primary concerns deals with perception, with both what I call camera vision as well as human perception or visual perception, and in particular the relationship between those two things. So, as you know, the show that was here is called Liminal, as is the book. And I chose that title for several reasons. Because, as I said, I consider the photograph a threshold between reality and perception. And my work explores the liminal zone between abstraction and realism. And I'm also drawn to liminal spaces. And so for about 5 years, I worked in the laneways of my neighborhood in downtown Toronto. And I'll talk a bit about laneways. I'm not sure if you have laneways here, but I'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, I'm going to talk about some of the work that you've seen if you saw the show here. And I'll be showing works from the Laneway project, as well as my series Ambiguous Landscapes and my newest work, just a couple of images from a series called Depiction. And I just want to first begin to talk about process, because the way that I work is very process-oriented. And process for me up to now has involved shooting primarily, and then reflecting on the material. I also develop my ideas through writing, but the shooting always comes first. And many of my discoveries have come from the act of shooting, from the act of looking through the lens. And I'll talk more about that later. But really through the act of photographing, as I see something through the lens, that's a starting point for me, and the beginning of an exploration of an idea. And the camera, because the camera has a particular way of seeing, that's something, again, that I'm interested in exploring in my work, just revealing the particularities of photography and of the camera in depicting the world, the real. Early in my practice, I had two epiphanies that continue to inform my work, the way that I work. One involves working within parameters. So, as I said earlier, I spent 5 years working in one part of the city in these laneways. And after about 3 years, I thought that I was done there. I think after 3 years, I'd made maybe 4 bodies of work. And I was quite sure that I was finished, but I pushed myself to go back into that environment the following summer. And it was at that point that 2 of my strongest, most fully realized bodies of work came into being. And that was Living Room and Threshold. The other epiphany I had involved following an instinct or an urge that I had, and for me that always resulted in taking a picture, even when I wasn't sure why I was compelled to make an image. I realized that it was important always to follow that instinct, and to go ahead and make the image or the images, and then just to let the idea, whatever it happened to be, unfold in its own time. My work evolves largely in response to place, or to place, and my encounters there. And I use the camera really as what I describe it as a prosthetic device for seeing, literally viewing my surroundings through the camera. And what I mean by prosthetic device for seeing is I found that the camera often sees what the eye can't see. And as I said earlier, it also sees things in a particular way that's somehow related to the way that we see, but different. So, to the laneways. In 1998, I began working here, and as you've seen from those 3 images, there's quite a bit of diversity in that environment. And these are laneways in my neighborhood, essentially, in the west end of Toronto, in a neighborhood called Little Italy. And the laneway is one of those liminal zones that I mentioned earlier. It's an area that's at once public and private, but not entirely either. And it's a hidden area in the city. And it's quite a charged area, I found. And that's because of this ambiguity that exists there between what is public and what is private space. And what I discovered quite quickly is that people are very territorial about this space. So the residents that live, whose properties back onto the lanes. And so I encountered a lot of aggression over the years as I was working there. People called the police, they yelled and screamed, they chased me. It was quite interesting. And the experiences that I had there began to enter into my work. My my work sort of, in some ways, took shape in response to those experiences, especially the ones involving, this feeling I had of being a trespasser, even though it was my neighborhood. So the early work in the laneways, these were taken just from my porch, so you can see I'm right in there, in that environment. That's where I live. So in my early work, I was examining, or I was drawing attention to this fragile interface and a mutable interface between public and private space. I worked within a 1 kilometer radius, essentially setting out on foot in the morning, and I worked in the summers because initially I needed the sunlight. For anyone who's not familiar with the laneways, they're a secondary system of streets behind properties. It's pretty clear here. And they're essentially a transitory space. And they're a place that, it's a pretty tranquil environment, but yet there's a lot of activity that happens, often sort of behind the closed door of the garage. Everything from winemaking to, what you would expect, people fixing their cars, grilling of vegetables, because it's an Italian and Portuguese neighborhood. There's lots of kind of food production going on back there, wine making. Anyway, as I was saying earlier, after about 3 years, I felt that I was finished working in that environment. But then I began this series called Living Room. And this is a series that I made over 4 years. As I would find this furniture that people discarded, I was always intrigued by it, but I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Until I had this experience very close to my house where I was shooting this series called Cosmos. And I was photographing this gate and going back every day to make more images. And I had the permission of the owner of the house. But there were a few Portuguese men who sort of congregated there, and they were clearly very unhappy by my presence. So one day when I went back to resume shooting, I discovered that someone had painted these white lines over the gate, essentially to discourage me from continuing to shoot there. And I found that very upsetting. I went home and I cried, not because I couldn't continue making the work, but just as a result of this really aggressive act and the lack of generosity on the part of whoever did this to just accept something that they didn't maybe understand. But what happened is I very quickly realized what I was going to do with this furniture that I'd been encountering, which is essentially garbage. I was going to use it to occupy the laneway in an empowered way. And I was going to use the camera to demarcate this space, this temporary space in the urban environment, in the public sphere. So the chair and my presence on the chair and the framing mechanism of the camera in creating this temporary space all combine to make this a living room. And I'm wearing this protective paper suit, both as a practical measure, but also as a metaphorical gesture. It neutralizes my presence. It makes me anonymous. It both separates me. It separates me from the environment that I'm also very much present in. So I'll just say a few words about this. I didn't include a lot of the earlier work. This was one of my earlier series, Cosmos. These are aluminum circular light boxes. And I was interested in I'm always interested in evoking photography in my work. And in this case, I was thinking about the camera as a scientific instrument, much like the telescope or the microscope. again, as this prosthetic device for seeing. All of these devices are used to enhance vision, to reveal something that's otherwise invisible to the naked eye. And in this case, these splatters were, they were not invisible to the naked eye, but they were, unnoticeable, unremarkable. And I made a number of bodies of work in the early years in the laneways that dealt with some of these issues, as well as exploring this scale shift that took place with the camera. I was using a macro lens, and so I was photographing small surface details that, when photographed and printed, shifted in scale and became unrecognizable and unfamiliar. I'm going to talk about threshold now, and again, just in terms of my process. I was often, in the laneways, I was often working on several bodies of work at the same time, and once I figured out what a body of work, what a series was, I would go, initially I should back up, I would go out exploring with my equipment. I would just go out, every day with my equipment and walk the laneways, and in a very exploratory way. And then when I would figure out what a work was, when I would see something and then pursue it, I would then go out and look for images for that body of work. So often and a lot of my work was ongoing over a couple of years, and so I would be working on several series at the same time. And one summer I was just compelled to make a photograph through this opening. And I shot it at first with the foreground in focus and the background out of focus, and then the opposite. And then as I did at the time, I processed my film, printed my contact sheets, cut them up, pinned them up on my board. And so these two images just sat there on my board for a year. And I would just sort of glance at them every now and then in my studio, but they didn't really move me in any way. But yet, as I said earlier, I'd felt compelled to make these images. And then the following summer when I went out shooting, again, I was photographing something else, and this time it was through a vertical slat in a fence. And again, I was compelled to make an image. I made a few images looking through this slat, and they didn't really work. But then there was this, kind of eureka moment where I saw what the work was. And I got really excited as I realized, I know what this is now. But it took me a little while. I continued shooting, and it took me a while to really finesse it and get it right. And then over 2 years, I went out and looked for the images that became Threshold. Often, what I saw in terms of the opening and then the image, there was quite a divergence there. So this is the same opening, and that was the picture that got made. So I was photographing through slats in fences and holes. Sometimes they were not holes. Sometimes, as is the case in this one, they were nail holes. The boundaries were often quite high. So in the case when I was shooting through nail holes, the nail holes were barely visible, let alone any view that could be seen through the opening. And I would often put my lens right up, touching the barrier. And some of the things that I was interested in this work, as I said earlier, I was already thinking a lot, very aware of the fact that I was in public space in the laneways, because they are technically public space. But at the same time, I always had this feeling that I was trespassing. And so that started to enter my work, with living room, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But also with this series, Threshold. But what I was really interested in this work is what was happening photographically, where this foreground and background were flattened. I mean, really flattened onto a single plane. And I was quite interested in this simultaneity of foreground and background, where you have this foreground color field and then a pictorial space beyond. And a lot of people are quite caught up when they look at this work in the voyeuristic aspect of it. Of course, I acknowledge that's there, and even the way that I finished the work with a matte surface and no glazing, that was intended to prevent, reflection, so that when people looked at the work, their eye was actually drawn into it and through the openings. Not because I wanted them to feel like a voyeur, but because I wanted them to be conscious of the act of looking. So this is a good example of what I was talking about earlier, which is the way that the camera can, render something that the eye can't see. So these really only exist photographically. And then from here, in 2002, I went to Holland, to Rotterdam, and I did a residency, and I was there for 4 months. And this body of work, Ambiguous Landscapes, came into being, not while I was there, but after I got back. It took a number of months after I returned for the work to sort of take shape. And while I was there, I was doing a lot of exploratory shooting, and I'm going to show you some of those images after I talk about this work. So this work, well, I should talk about what I was thinking about when I was in Holland. I don't speak any Dutch, and of course the Dutch are, notoriously good at speaking English. But yet, when I walked around the city, everyone, of course, was speaking Dutch. And I couldn't understand anything. And it was actually quite a comforting feeling, because, when you're in a noisy place and you're trying to focus on something, and you hear language that you understand, and it enters your consciousness, and it can be disruptive. And so there, it was just like a hum that was, and I felt like I was sort of in a bubble, moving through the city in this bubble. And so I was really conscious the whole time I was there of my body moving through space, of being sort of detached from the space that I was moving through in a way because of this language barrier. And so I was thinking a lot about this language barrier as almost a tangible thing. And my studio, I had just the most unbelievable studio space. I was in this technical school. It's a very large artist complex called Duende, where I think there were 75 working artists in this building. And the studios were enormous, with 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, and I had about maybe 1,200 square feet, and it was just a space. It was like a white void. There was almost no furniture in it, and I'd come from a very stressful period in Toronto with too much work, and so I really just needed to. It was the perfect sort of space for a respite, and I could just let my mind wander. I just remember the first night I was in this studio, just sitting there, quite low to the ground, and just, in this white void. It was really like a void. And I'm talking about this because it informed this series, Ambiguous Landscapes, one of the works that I made. Anyway, so these are some of the things that I'm just trying to give you a sense of, sort of some of the things that were going through my mind while I was there. I started out I spent a lot of time actually in this urban forest at night after dark, and in the summer, it's quite far north, so it doesn't get dark until very late, sort of 12:30, 1. And I would go to this urban forest with my camera equipment. And at first I went alone, and then my friends all got upset with me because it was quite dangerous. I had this sort of illusion that Holland was this really happy, safe place, but actually Rotterdam's quite a dangerous city because it's a port city and because of the drug trafficking. Anyway, so I ended up getting a bodyguard, the boyfriend of a friend of mine, and he loved to be out at night, and he just liked to sit in the dark. So he was the perfect companion. And he was actually a yoga teacher, so he was not exactly the perfect bodyguard. But anyway, but he was there with me, and that made me feel somewhat comfortable. But anyway, the area that I ended up, so I was drawn to this forest because it was an artificial forest. So a lot of Holland it's a very man-made country. It's such a small country and with such a large population. And so I was also really thinking a lot about that, the artifice, nature and artifice. And so even this natural environment of the forest had this artificial quality to it. A lot of, lights, and so nature, the trees were all lit up. And so that's what I was photographing. I was photographing foliage that was illuminated by artificial light. And I'll show you some of those shortly. And it didn't go anywhere. What I found is when I got back, suddenly I started noticing a lot of artists who were making these pictures of nature at night and artificial light, and it just, that wasn't enough to put me off, but I just didn't feel like there was enough there in the work to pursue, so I didn't pursue it, and that happens sometimes. So I'm just I should be showing you those images while I'm talking about, maybe I'll just flip ahead to those images that I'm talking about there, so you know what I'm talking about. So these are some of the images that I was making there. So there was this kind of, even though it's nature and it's real, real trees and real branches and leaves, I found that it had this kind of dioramic quality. It just looked very artificial, and that was something that was exciting to me at the time. But like I said, there just wasn't enough there for me to pursue. Anyway, so going back to Ambiguous Landscapes. So essentially, this was the first piece in the series, and this is Zeeland, it's on the coast. It's where people go to the beach. This is a dike, and I think it was my second to last day in Holland, and a German friend and I just went on this road trip to the beach. It was going to take, 25 minutes to get there by car. I was navigating though, and I'm a notoriously bad navigator, so it took us about 4 hours to find the beach. And so by the time we found the beach, it was, the end of the day. And I just made a few snapshots of him. People ride their bikes across the top or walk across the top. And I just made a couple of snapshots of him on the dike. And so that became some of the material that I was looking at when I got home, and that was a really important piece. And then there were these other things that I'd been thinking about that I was describing to you. And so I started, whereas previously I'd always, the work did start in the camera, but I started to formulate the pictures in my mind, and then I went about making them. So it was sort of a transition in my work into a different way of working. So this work comprises these large-scale 4 by 5 foot photographs, an empty landscape, and then one with a figure in it, as well as a video piece of small framed videos that are framed like photographs that are mounted, wall-mounted, so they appear like pictures. And I think of them that way, as moving pictures or moving stills, really, because they're mostly still. And in this work I was using, you saw me in my work previously, the work is never about self-portraiture, but I'm using the figure myself, it turns out, as an index, in this case a spatial index. So when you look at the empty landscape, you don't have a sense of perspective or scale until you see that same landscape with the figure in it. And the figure doesn't give it all away to you. There's still ambiguity. You don't really get a sense of the vastness of the space or the shape of the topography. And so that's why I added the video. The video was essential to augment some of these ideas, as well as to address the temporal in the work. So this is Kamloops, and the stair piece is Helsinki. So again, just to go back to the process, there were a couple of images in this series that I set out to make, like the snow piece. Then there were others that I just found, like the stair piece when I was in Helsinki doing a residency, and I was on the streetcar one day and I drove by this cathedral and I saw a wall, and it was the stair. And so I went back. It took me about 3 weeks to find that site again, but I finally did. And then it took me about 3 months to make the pictures, because that site was the most popular tourist attraction in Helsinki, and I needed an empty stair. So I was there in the summer, during midsummer, when there's almost no darkness. So I shot the video myself at 5 a.m. And then I somehow miraculously got the photographs made in the middle of the day with the stairs covered in people, just directing people and waiting for the sun, or actually the cloud. Anyway, I digress. This piece was Kamloops, and it was a work, the gallery there commissioned the work, and I grew up in Kamloops, and what I remembered most in Kamloops was these foothills that surround the city that change color over the day, over the day and over the seasons. So I really wanted to make a piece, and at first I didn't know what I would do there, but I hoped that I would find a work that would incorporate these foothills, and luckily I did find a hill that, had from a certain angle appeared sort of horizontal across the top. And this is Toronto. Again, I knew that I was going to make a grass piece, and so I just had to find the right site. So back to these images. So this is one exploration that I was engaged in during my residency. And then something else that I was photographing these piles, and I was photographing the weeds that I was interested in, again, in this kind of scale shift that was happening. So I don't know if you would have thought that was a tree if I hadn't told you it was a weed, but anyway, so I was sort of, playing around with this kind of thing. And then I was also, I was in Holland, and I was looking at painting, Dutch painting, and I was very aware of the big sky, and so I was, so this is an image I made. And then I was, just recently, I pulled out some of my books of postcards that I've been collecting over the years. This is one of them. And this is Friedrich, German painter. And I started to see some parallels between what I've been focusing on in my work and these images that I haven't looked at for years and years, but they were obviously in my consciousness. This is Harry Callahan. It's a seashore. That's also Harry Callahan. So I decided to include them in this talk, just as a way to sort of discuss or mention this idea of influence, since I'm talking about process. I was quite surprised to rediscover these images and realize that, I mean, I can't say that I was directly influenced, but perhaps I was. Oh, I have to tell you what this is. This is another something this I shot in my studio, and it's not quite working as I intended, but anyway. As I was describing, sitting in this big white space, in this void, and again thinking about, the figure moving through space, and this was a little exploration I did where I shot this with a still camera, and what I was attempting was, I was trying to explore sort of how I was working with depth of field and how the figure, I wanted the figure to come in and out of focus as she was moving through this space. So it didn't exactly work, but that's what I was sort of exploring there. And this is one of Landscapes videos, the Banff piece. It's a little bit low res, sorry about that. Very low res. So as you can see in these pieces, there's a very long period of emptiness and stillness. And of course, that was a conscious choice. I intended the work to be meditative. And I was also interested in some ambiguity between, about what you were looking at in terms of, a still versus a moving image. But with video, that's difficult to achieve because the pixels are always moving. So it's one of the reasons that I kept them quite small, was to maintain a higher resolution image. But I would have liked to have shot the work in film. You probably don't know what film is, you guys. This is Helsinki. It's really interesting how, I've been thinking about just how impatient I am. I mean, I think that many of us are today. And I've been noticing with my BlackBerry, when I'm on hold, it's got a timer. So I can see actually how long I've been on hold. And I find that after about a minute and 10 seconds, I feel like I've been on hold for like 10 minutes. It's really strange. So even just watching a piece like this, where you're sort of waiting, I sometimes find that I even get a little bit tense, which is not the intended experience. And I've just got a couple of images of my newest work, which is in progress. It's called Depiction. And this is one of 4 panels. And this is a series that I started shooting after Threshold, so 2003. And I've shot it over 4 years, so I have a lot of material, and I've just started working with it. And it's my first digital work. It's shot on transparency, and transparencies that I'm scanning, but I'm working with the images digitally. And here, all I've done is just composite them. But I'm going to be doing some layering work with this series, as well as some moving image pieces. But essentially, these are front yard gardens, again in my neighborhood. And I've shot them in layers, so using depth of field to move through this space from the extreme foreground of the sidewalk to the building at the back. And then, as you can see here, I've composited them into a single picture, so it's a single photograph. And as your eyes are moving across the picture horizontally, you're moving into the image. You're moving deeper into the image. So the depth is completely constructed, and you're reminded of the flatness of the photograph, the two-dimensionality of the photograph. So I think that's it. Yep. The end. So I'd love to talk if anyone wants to engage. If you have any questions, don't be shy. Yeah, I mean, generally, I find that when you work with photography, it's a very precise medium, and I mean, so it's demanding in that way, and it's something that I struggle a bit with, because I really want to make a mess. And, but I find that every time I start a new body of work, I approach it in a very sort of meticulous way. But yet there is this organic process in terms of sort of figuring out what the work is. But, and so that's a very free, it's a very free sort of component of the practice. But even then, even with that, I know I'm not exactly answering your question, but even with that, I found, even with that loose, sort of more exploratory approach, I found that like for example, I would not shoot enough film. Sometimes I was sort of trying to conserve film as I was out there, and I would have to go back and reshoot because I just hadn't made quite enough images. And so even though there was this sort of organic, exploratory approach to the process, I found that I was still sort of trying to control it too much. So, but I think that that more organic, intuitive part of practice is really important. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
No, I just thought that the two ways of working were quite different.
Mm-hmm. I have that in my. I have to. Yeah, I have to say that I have those two extremes in my character as well. I'm very chaotic, but also very fastidious. So. Yeah. Well, I'm not shooting digitally yet. And I've really been resistant to make the switch because, well, for a lot of reasons. I'm pretty heavily invested in analog in terms of equipment, for one thing. But also, to have to change, I like film. I really like film. And film is not the same thing as, the digital. It doesn't, the cameras don't read reality in the same way. But they're getting closer all the time. So I was really resistant to anything digital. But but now I'm thinking about just getting a digital camera and only shooting digitally for the ease of it. Just to have a rectangular format camera that I can just carry around almost like a snapshot camera, and just have that sort of looseness with working instead of having to put everything on a tripod and so. Yeah, early on, I did really wrestle with it early in my work. Like, it was actually, I think when I was making Threshold, I shot a lot of film, so I had a lot of images, and I did have a little bit of trouble sort of drawing the line, And then when I drew the line at 28, then I went in the other direction, and I worried that I didn't have enough images, But ultimately, I don't think I struggle anymore. But ultimately, I think when the work's done, and you just intuitively know, hopefully, you can, ascertain which are the strongest pieces, and also, then there's the question of, well, depending on what you're trying to say, do you need more than one image to convey, that? I think it depends what you're doing, and I don't think there's any, I don't think there are any rules.